You know what you need to do. You have known for some time. The conversation you need to have, the work you need to begin, the decision you have been circling for months or years. And something keeps not happening. Not because of external obstacles. You have checked, and the obstacles are not what is stopping you. Not because you lack the capacity. You have the capacity, and some part of you knows you have it. Something else is operating. Something that looks from the outside like laziness or fear or bad luck. But that has a specific consistency, a pattern that appears in too many different contexts to be coincidental, that has been present for too long to be situational, that feels, when you examine it honestly, less like something happening to you and more like something you are doing. Jung had a framework for this, and the framework does not begin where most explanations of self-sabotage begin, with the behavior, with the pattern, with what you are doing wrong. It begins with the question that most explanations never ask. What is the self-sabotage protecting? Self-sabotage is one of the most searched terms in psychology, and one of the most consistently misunderstood. The mainstream explanation tends toward one of two frameworks. The behavioral, which locates the problem in habits and patterns that can be identified and replaced, or the motivational, which locates the problem in fear of failure, low self-worth, or the belief that success is not available to someone like you. Both frameworks contain genuine insight, and both stop short of the question that Jung's framework demands. Not what is the self-sabotage doing to you, but what is it doing for you? Because in the Jungian understanding, no psychological pattern, however destructive its consequences, however genuinely costly its operation, is without function. The psyche does not produce suffering randomly. It produces it in the service of something, and the work of understanding self-sabotage is the work of understanding what that something is. The counterintuitive turn that Jung's framework produces, the turn that is the center of this video, is this. Self-sabotage is not primarily the enemy of the self. It is, in most cases, the protection of something the self considers more important than the goal being sabotaged. The person who sabotages the promotion is not, at the deepest level, afraid of success. They are protecting something, an identity, a relationship, a loyalty, a self-concept that the success would threaten. The person who cannot finish the creative project is not, at the deepest level, afraid of failure. They are protecting the possibility, the unlived potential that exists only as long as it has never been tested. The sabotage is not the problem. It is the solution to a problem the conscious mind has not yet been willing to name. This video is about self-sabotage in the Jungian framework, not as a behavioral problem to be solved, but as a communication to be understood. What the pattern is protecting, where the protection came from, how the shadow and the complex and the unlived life contribute to the specific forms that self-sabotage takes, and what becomes possible when the protection is understood rather than simply overridden. This is not a video that will give you 5 steps to stop sabotaging yourself. It is a video that will suggest that the self-sabotage you most want to stop is the self-sabotage most worth understanding first. Before the Jungian framework can be applied to self-sabotage, a distinction needs to be made that most discussions of the topic either blur or ignore entirely. The distinction between self-sabotage as a conscious pattern and self-sabotage as an unconscious one. The person who consciously avoids a difficult conversation because they know it will be uncomfortable is not, in the Jungian sense, self-sabotaging. They are making a choice, however costly, that they are aware of making. The person who genuinely intends to have the conversation, who has decided to have it, who has even rehearsed it, and who finds when the moment arrives that something intervenes, a sudden loss of urgency, a reframing of the situation as less serious than it seemed, an inexplicable tiredness, a distraction that appears at precisely the wrong moment. That is self-sabotage in the Jungian sense. It is the psyche acting against the stated intentions of the conscious self, and it requires a different explanation than conscious avoidance. Jung understood the psyche as not unified, not a single coherent self with consistent intentions that sometimes fails to follow through, but as a multiplicity of partially autonomous structures, each with its own history, its own logic, and its own goals, that are only imperfectly coordinated by the conscious ego. The complex, The psychic structure formed around an emotionally charged experience or pattern of experiences operates with its own logic, pursues its own goals, and is not bound by the ego's intentions. When the ego sets a goal that conflicts with the complex's goals, the complex does not simply defer, it acts. It produces the distraction, the sudden loss of motivation, the inexplicable resistance, the behavior that undermines what the conscious mind decided to do. This is not weakness of will. It is the operation of a psychic structure that is more powerful, in its specific territory, than the ego's intentions. The most important implication of this framework for understanding self-sabotage is that willpower, the standard prescription for self-sabotage, the idea that what is needed is more discipline, more commitment, more determination to override the resistance, is not only ineffective but actively counterproductive when the resistance is organized and driven by a complex. Overriding the complex's resistance without understanding what the complex is protecting does not resolve the conflict. It intensifies it. The complex that is overridden does not disappear. It finds another vector, another form, another moment to reimpose the protection it was organized to provide. The person who forces themselves through the resistance without understanding its source does not solve the self-sabotage. They relocate it. Picture this with precision. A person who has identified a pattern of self-sabotage in their professional life, who consistently underperforms in high-visibility situations, who fails to deliver on the opportunities that would advance their career, who has tried, repeatedly and with genuine commitment, to override the pattern through discipline and willpower. Each attempt produces the same result: initial momentum, followed by a specific point at which the pattern reasserts itself, followed by the exhaustion and self-recrimination of someone who has failed again at something they know they should be able to do. What the willpower framework cannot explain, and what the Jungian framework can, is why the pattern reasserts itself at the same specific point every time. That point is not random. It is the threshold at which the complex's protection engages. Understanding what is being protected at that threshold is the work that willpower cannot do, and that the Jungian framework is specifically equipped to address. Every instance of self-sabotage is protecting something. The protection may be organized around fear, but the fear is almost always more specific and more psychologically interesting than the generic fear of failure or success that most explanations invoke. It may be organized around identity, the specific self-concept that the success would require the person to revise. It may be organized around relationship, the loyalty to a family system, a social group, a set of expectations that the achievement would violate. It may be organized around possibility, the preservation of the unlived potential that exists only as long as it has never been tested. And it may be organized around punishment, the unconscious belief installed by experiences that predate conscious memory, that success is not safe, that visibility is dangerous, that wanting too much produces consequences that are worse than not having what you want. The identity protection is the most common form and the most consistently underestimated. Every significant achievement requires a revision of the self-concept, an expansion of what the person understands themselves to be capable of, an update to the story they tell themselves about who they are. And this revision, however desirable from the outside, is genuinely threatening to a self-concept that has been stable, that has organized the person's life and relationships around its specific contours, that has, however limiting, the quality of familiarity and predictability that the revised self-concept does not yet have. The person who has organized their identity around being the one who almost makes it, the talented but unrealized, the person of potential rather than of achievement, is not simply failing to succeed. They are protecting the identity that the success would dismantle. And the dismantling, however necessary, is experienced by the psyche as a kind of loss before it can be experienced as a gain. The loyalty protection is less frequently named and more powerful than most people expect. Human beings are social animals whose psychological survival, in the original environment, depended on their embeddedness in a group, on belonging to a family system, a tribe, a community whose acceptance was not optional. And the group's acceptance is, in most family systems and social contexts, conditional, not unconditional, which means it can be lost. The child who grows up in a family system where achievement beyond the family's level produces disconnection, where going further than the parents, wanting more than the family's expectations, becoming visible in ways the family cannot accommodate, learns at a level that is entirely pre-rational and entirely real, that success is a form of abandonment. And the adult who carries this learning does not consciously choose loyalty over achievement. The choice is made automatically and invisibly by the part of the psyche that learned before language that belonging is not separable from staying within the bounds of what the group can hold. Picture the specific texture of the loyalty protection operating in an adult life. A first-generation professional, the first in her family to reach a certain level of achievement, who finds that the closer she gets to her next professional threshold, the more frequent her contact with her family becomes, the more she finds herself reverting in family contexts to an earlier version of herself, the more the achievement feels somehow like a betrayal of something she cannot quite name. She does not consciously choose to slow down. She does not consciously decide that loyalty requires underachievement. But the psyche has its own accounting, and the accounting that was installed in the original family system, in which achievement beyond the family's level produced a specific quality of distance, is still running. The sabotage is the psyche's attempt to pay what the accounting demands. The shadow, Jung's term for the repository of everything the conscious personality has excluded, suppressed, or failed to develop, has a specific and underappreciated relationship with self-sabotage. The most obvious connection is the one that most Jungian discussions of the topic make: the dark shadow contents, the rage, the selfishness, the destructive impulses that are not integrated into the conscious personality find expression through the back door that self-sabotage provides. The person who cannot consciously access their aggression finds that the aggression expresses itself as the missed deadline, the forgotten commitment, the underperformance in context where someone is counting on them. The sabotage is the shadow's way of acting when the conscious self has denied it direct expression. But there is a second and more counterintuitive connection between the shadow and self-sabotage that is rarely examined. The connection through the golden shadow, through the suppressed potential, and the unlived life. The person whose genuine capacity, creative, intellectual, relational, went into the shadow because it was incompatible with the identity they constructed or were assigned, is not simply lacking access to that capacity. They are in an active and ongoing conflict with it. The golden shadow presses for expression. The constructed identity resists. And self-sabotage is frequently the product of this conflict, the way the constructed identity maintains its boundaries against the pressure of what it excluded. The person who sabotages the creative project is not always afraid of failure. Sometimes they are afraid of success, of what it would mean, of the identity revision it would require, of the life it would open that the current identity cannot accommodate. Here is what this looks like in a specific life. A man in his 40s who has a professional life that is successful and genuinely meaningful to him, and who has, for as long as he can remember, also had a parallel creative practice that has never quite become anything. He starts projects with genuine energy and abandons them at the same point every time, the point just before they would need to be shown, shared, tested against reality. He has a sophisticated explanation for each abandonment. The timing was wrong. The project wasn't ready. Something more urgent came up. But the pattern, the specific and consistent point of abandonment, is more precise than any of the explanations. What the pattern is protecting is the possibility. As long as the creative work is never finished, never shown, never tested, it retains the quality of potential. It is still something he could be, something that exists in the shadow as unlived life. Finishing it would require converting the possibility into a reality, which would require risking the reality's inadequacy, which would require surrendering the protection that the unfinished state provides. Jung called this the provisional life, the life organized around the sense that the real life is still coming, that the current arrangement is temporary, that the genuine self is being preserved in the meanwhile for a future moment when the conditions will be right. The provisional life is maintained by self-sabotage, by the consistent failure to fully commit to any path, to finish any project that would convert the possible into the actual, to take any step that would require the genuine self to show up as something real, rather than as something potential. It is one of the most common and most psychologically invisible forms of self-sabotage. Invisible, because it does not look like sabotage from the inside. It looks like wisdom, like patience, like the reasonable decision to wait until things are clearer. The clarity, in the provisional life, never quite arrives. Beneath most persistent patterns of self-sabotage, the patterns that return, despite genuine effort to change them, that reassert themselves at the same threshold every time, that survive the application of willpower and behavioral strategies, there is almost always a complex, a psychic structure formed around an early experience or pattern of experiences that installed a specific belief about what is safe, what is possible, what success means, what visibility costs. The complex does not announce itself as a complex. It presents itself as reality, as simply the way things are, as the reasonable conclusion of a person who has learned from experience what happens when they want too much, reach too far, become too visible.
It has the feeling of knowledge, not of distortion. And that is precisely what makes it so effective as the engine of self-sabotage. The most common complex at the root of self-sabotage is what might be called the unworthiness complex, the psychic structure organized around the belief, installed before conscious memory, that the self is not adequate to the thing being pursued.
Not as a conscious thought. Most people who carry this complex would reject its explicit formulation, but as an operational assumption that runs beneath conscious intention and that produces, at the threshold of success, the automatic response that something has gone wrong, that the success is a mistake, that the discovery of inadequacy is imminent. The imposter syndrome that appears at high levels of professional achievement is frequently the surface expression of this complex, the conscious manifestation of a deeper structure that was installed long before the professional context, and that has been running with remarkable consistency in every context where genuine visibility became possible. There's a specific scene that captures the unworthiness complex at the moment of its operation, a moment that most people who carry this complex have experienced and that most would not, without the framework, recognize as a complex signature rather than as accurate self-knowledge. The moment just after a significant success, a promotion, a creative achievement, a relationship that is clearly working, when instead of the settled satisfaction the success should produce, what arrives is a specific anxiety, not the ordinary anxiety of new responsibility, something more fundamental than that, the specific feeling that the success is undeserved, that it was a mistake, that the environment will shortly discover its error and correct it. The success is real. The achievement is genuine. And the psyche is responding not to the present reality, but to the complex's installed belief about what kind of reality is available to someone like this. The second most common complex at the root of self-sabotage is what might be called the visibility complex, the psychic structure organized around the belief, again installed before conscious memory, that being seen is dangerous. That success, which produces visibility, produces exposure, which produces vulnerability to consequences that were real in the original context, and that the complex continues to treat as real in every subsequent context. The child who was shamed for achievement, in a family system where standing out was threatening to the family's equilibrium, in a peer context where visible success produced exclusion, in a cultural context where ambition was coded as dangerous, learns that visibility costs. And the adult who carries this learning does not consciously choose invisibility. The complex chooses it, automatically, preconsciously, at precisely the threshold where the visibility would become real. Picture what this looks like in a specific life. A writer who produces work privately that is, by any honest assessment, ready to be seen, who has been told this by the few people who have read it, who knows it themselves in moments of genuine clarity, and who consistently finds reasons why this particular piece is not quite ready, why this particular moment is not quite right, why the submission that would make the work visible should wait a little longer. The waiting has been happening for 3 years. The work has been ready for 2. The complex is not protecting the work from rejection. It is protecting the person from the exposure that submission would produce, from the specific vulnerability of being seen, which the original context taught was not safe, and which the complex continues to treat as not safe regardless of how much the actual context has changed. Self-sabotage announces itself through patterns, not through individual incidents, which are always explainable, but through the repetition of the same structure across different contexts at the same threshold, producing the same result. The person who has failed at the same point in 3 different professional contexts is not having bad luck 3 times. They are carrying a pattern that is more consistent than any explanation organized around external circumstances can account for. The first and most important work of understanding self-sabotage is the willingness to look at the pattern honestly, to resist the explanations that organize each instance as separate and situational, and to ask the question that the pattern demands. What is the same in these situations? What threshold am I reaching in each of them at the point where things go wrong? The threshold question is the most diagnostically useful question available for understanding self-sabotage, because the threshold is where the complex engages, and the complex's engagement point is specific and consistent. The person whose self-sabotage is organized around the unworthiness complex will find that the threshold is approximately the same in every context. The point at which the success would become undeniable, the point at which the achievement would require genuine visibility, the point at which the internal narrative of being almost good enough would have to be revised. The person whose self-sabotage is organized around the loyalty complex will find a different threshold, the point at which the achievement would create a gap between themselves and the people they need to remain connected to. The threshold is the complex's fingerprint, and finding it, honestly, without the protective explanations, is the beginning of understanding what the sabotage is protecting. There is a specific quality to the moment just before self-sabotage that is worth learning to recognize. A quality that is different from ordinary resistance or ordinary avoidance. It is a quality of sudden fog, a previously clear situation becoming somehow ambiguous, a previously solid motivation becoming somehow less convincing, a previously straightforward path developing complications that were not visible until the threshold was approached. This fog is the complex's doing. It is the psychic mechanism through which the complex produces the conditions for the sabotage, without the sabotage appearing as a choice. If the person could see clearly that they were choosing to undermine their own goal, they might choose differently. The fog prevents the clarity. And learning to recognize the fog, to notice when clarity that was present has suddenly and inexplicably become murkiness, is one of the most practically useful skills the Jungian framework offers for working with self-sabotage. Picture a woman who has spent years trying to understand why she consistently fails to complete the applications for grants, for positions, for opportunities that would advance her creative work. Each application begins with genuine energy. Each one reaches the same point, approximately 70% complete, and stops. There is always a reason. The deadline changed. A more urgent project appeared. She realized the application wasn't quite right and needed to be reconsidered from the beginning. The reasons are always plausible. But the pattern, 70% consistently across 5 years and a dozen applications, is more precise than any of the reasons. The threshold is not at the beginning, where the resistance would be obvious. It is at 70%, at the point where the application is close enough to completion that finishing it would require confronting the possibility of both submission and rejection. The fog arrives at 70%. It has been arriving at 70% for 5 years. That precision is not bad luck. That is the complex. And that precision, the specific repeatable threshold, is also the most direct route to understanding what the complex is protecting, which is where the next chapter begins. Working with self-sabotage in the Jungian framework is not the same as trying to stop it. Trying to stop it, applying willpower to override the pattern, committing more firmly to the goal, developing stricter accountability structures, addresses the surface behavior without addressing the underlying structure that produces it. And the underlying structure unaddressed will find another form, another threshold, another expression of the same protection. The work that the Jungian framework calls for is the work of understanding the protection, of developing enough relationship with the complex that is driving the sabotage to be able to ask it, genuinely and with the willingness to receive an honest answer. What are you protecting? What was the experience that installed you? What do you believe will happen if the thing you are preventing actually happens? The first movement of this work is the examination of the pattern with curiosity rather than with self-criticism. This is more difficult than it sounds, because the standard response to identified self-sabotage is self-recrimination, and self-recrimination, however understandable, is one of the most effective ways of preventing the genuine examination that the pattern requires. Self-criticism is organized around the behavior, what you did wrong, what you failed to do, what the pattern cost you. Curiosity is organized around the structure, why the behavior makes sense from inside the complex's logic, what the pattern was protecting, when the protection was installed, and in what context. The shift from self-criticism to curiosity does not excuse the behavior. It makes the behavior intelligible, and intelligibility is the prerequisite for genuine change. The second movement is the identification of what the sabotage is protecting. The specific asset, identity, relationship, or possibility that the complex has determined is more important than the goal being undermined. This requires the willingness to sit with the question long enough for an honest answer to emerge, not the first answer, which is usually organized around the acceptable explanations, but the answer that comes when those explanations have been examined and found insufficient. The woman whose creative applications consistently stop at 70% is not, at the deepest level, afraid of rejection. She is afraid of completion, of converting the possible into the actual, of surrendering the protection that the unfinished state provides. That is a different problem than fear of rejection, and it requires a different response. Not more courage in the face of rejection, more willingness to let the possible become real. The third movement, and the one that Jung would consider the most essential, is the negotiation with the complex rather than the war against it. The complex is protecting something real. The protection was installed for reasons that were genuine and that, in the original context, may have been necessary. The work is not to destroy the complex, but to develop enough conscious relationship with it to be able to offer it something other than the sabotage as a way of protecting what it is protecting. Here is what this negotiation looks like in a specific moment. The first-generation professional whose psyche has its own accounting organized around the cost of surpassing her family's level sights, for the first time, with the question of what the loyalty complex is actually protecting. Not the achievement, the belonging. And she asks with genuine curiosity, is it possible to pursue the achievement and maintain the belonging, not by hiding the achievement, not by minimizing it in family contexts, but by finding a way of carrying both that does not require her to choose? The negotiation does not resolve the complex immediately. It changes the relationship with it. From a force operating automatically behind her back to a part of herself she can speak with, reason with, and gradually bring toward a life that is large enough to include both what the complex was protecting and what she has been trying to become. There is a specific realization that arrives in genuine work with self-sabotage that is different from the realizations produced by behavioral approaches to the pattern, different from the insight that the behavior is costing you, different from the recognition that you are capable of more than the pattern allows. It is the realization that the self-sabotage was, in its own terms, rational, that the complex which produced it was organized around a genuine protection of something genuinely important, that the part of you that kept not finishing, kept not submitting, kept not showing up at the threshold where the real risk was real, was not your enemy. It was doing its best, with the tools and the logic available to it, to protect you from something that, in the original context, required protection. This realization does not excuse the cost of the sabotage. It changes the relationship with the part of the self that produced it, from contempt to something closer to the understanding you would extend to any part of yourself that was trying, however clumsily, to keep you safe. Jung's understanding of the psyche was not that it produces suffering because it is broken, or because there is something fundamentally wrong with the person experiencing the suffering. It was that the psyche produces suffering when it is in conflict with itself, when the goals of the conscious self and the goals of the unconscious structures that formed around earlier experiences are genuinely incompatible, and when neither side of the conflict has enough information about the other to find a resolution that serves the whole. Self-sabotage is that conflict made visible. It is the place where the psyche's internal incompatibility, produces external consequences that cannot be explained by external circumstances. And the work of resolving it is not the work of strengthening one side of the conflict against the other. It is the work of bringing enough consciousness to both sides that a resolution is possible that neither side would have found alone. The question of what the self-sabotage was protecting leads eventually to a question that is both simpler and more difficult than any of the questions the behavioral framework asks. What do I actually want? Not what I should want. Not what would be reasonable to want given my circumstances and my history and the expectations of the people whose regard matters to me. But what I actually want, in the sense of what the genuine self, underneath the constructed identity and the complex's protection and the loyalty to the family system's expectations, is organized around. The self-sabotage is frequently the answer to this question in disguise. The thing that the sabotage is protecting, when examined honestly, is often the thing the genuine self most needs. The possibility, the identity, the life that the constructed self has been preventing, not because it is unavailable, but because claiming it would require becoming someone the constructed self has not yet been willing to be. If you recognized your own pattern in this video, the specific threshold, the specific fog, the specific form that the protection takes in your life, then the question this video leaves you with is not, how do I stop doing this? It is, what is this protecting? What did I learn, early enough that I no longer remember learning it, about what happens when I want this particular thing? What is the part of me that keeps not finishing, keeps not submitting, keeps not showing up? What is it trying to keep safe? The answer to that question will not stop the self-sabotage immediately, but it will change the conversation. From a war against a part of yourself that has been trying, in its own way, to take care of you, to a negotiation with that part toward a life that is large enough to include both what the complex was protecting and what the genuine self has been trying all along to become.